Thanks, Dr. McMorris. Colleagues, good afternoon. Thanks to Prof. Taylor, Andy Park, and others for the kind invitation to participate and share some ideas in our conversation this afternoon. And I thank Holly, too, for, in 5 minutes, she did a really, really effective job of taking us through the ethical landscape and really pointing out to us the key notion that ethics should not be an add-on to our scientific process. And in fact, what I was happy about in seeing how the whole notion of solar radiation management governance was being deployed was the fact that right at the beginning point, the start out, we recognized the value and the importance of the ethical dimension and that we had to treat with it in a very important fashion. Now, all the speakers here this afternoon, this morning, have made clear to us that we're faced with a crisis of environmental proportions that's affecting each and every one of us. And more importantly, the fact of us being here and engaging in this conversation, for me, signals that we're willing to take responsibility, Prof, and that we are searching for viable solutions to the problem. Perhaps through geoengineering, perhaps not, because we do have the choice as to whether we engage with the technology or not. And it's important for us to realize that the choice is present and they're in our hands. Now, when I look at what it is that we're wrestling with, to me, I can sort of wrap it up in 2 Ps, that we're in a space of promise and peril. Yeah? It seems like this technology is promising the possibility of reducing temperatures very quickly, and perhaps, as Juan is showing us, very cheaply as well. But there's always going to be some kind of price that we have to pay for engaging with the technology. And that's the side of the peril, where there is both scientific and institutional uncertainties that we have not yet fully recognized or engaged with. And that's where we have to take account of the ethical dimension that has to do with our humanity. And how is it that a process such as this one engages with developing, enhancing, transforming our humanity in a fashion that leads us in a direction that is helpful rather than being potentially harmful, as we have pointed out here. Now, when I looked at how the process was going forward and some of the deliberations that had been engaged, I recognized that the process was engaging with stakeholder attitudes and, listening to Andy on the radio this morning and reading the literature and so on. There was a great attempt in this project to draw on input from various expertise from science and law, development, international studies, and of course, ethics. But what wasn't clear to me was whether there was any religious conversation going on. And I figure when we come into a space such as the Jamaican space, the Caribbean space, because of how important the religious dimension is for all kinds of deliberations, I figure that it might make sense for us to think through, recognize a little bit about what the religious could contribute. And if you remember Mr. Lewis's presentation this morning, he straight up started to speak from his perspective as one being a religious perspective. And in fact, it was interesting that the example that he started out with was about flying in the face of God. And whether we like it or not, there are some religious perspectives that see science as being wholly problematic, that science is actually human beings perhaps in being engaged in the Icarus project, wanting to fly when the divine didn't give us wings, yeah? And they have to be a part of the conversation as well. We need to engage and to understand what they're saying, because actually they have pointed us to something of value or importance. Some of what we're wrestling with right now, global warming and all of that, has happened because as human beings we have attempted to manipulate genes and manipulated our reality because of the power of technology, the power of the human mind. So something's going on there with what those religious groups are saying that we have to take account of. Of course, I come from a religious perspective that doesn't quite go in the direction of saying that any kind of attempt at using technology in the way that it has been used with all its promise and peril is a sin, or it's what's causing us to be in such a bad place. Yes, but yes and no. So I believe that, and I'm speaking here from a Catholic perspective, but I could well be speaking from perhaps the Baptist perspective as well, because particularly in our Jamaican space, we do know that the Baptist Church has done quite a bit of work on the environment and stewardship. In our space in the Caribbean, our Catholic bishops have written an encyclical called Caring for the Earth, where the attempt was being made for us to take account of how we ought to live in this world and how our religious faith impacts on the world that we're living in. But specifically, I wanted to introduce you to a new document that came out of the Roman Catholic tradition. You know, we have what we call our Catholic social teaching tradition, where the church speaks to continually issues having to do with the social, the political, the economic. And a new document came out in 2015, written by the new Pope Francis, that was called Laudate Si, on care of our common home. And Laudate Si means praise be to you, and it's some words coming out of a canticle by St. Francis of Assisi. Now, in this particular document, the Pope makes an appeal to us. Now, documents such as this, put out by the Catholic Church, speaks directly to members of the Church, but also speaks in a lot of ways to what the Pope will talk about as men and women of goodwill. And it's important for us to recognize that a document such as that is opening up a conversation beyond just the religious community. And I commend that to this project, that the conversation should be a broad one, and it should include religious as well as non-religious people. Now, what's going on in this document is that the Pope bases the call that he makes for us to protect the common home that we have, the earth. And he's calling us to acknowledge the immensity and the urgency of the challenge that we face. And I heard pretty much quite a bit of that this morning as we listened to all the presenters that spoke with us today. He bases his call on the best scientific knowledge of the day to provide a concrete foundation for the ethical and spiritual itinerary that he lays out. And he also presents principles like the common good, and those of you might be familiar with it. The common good has to do with the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and the individuals that make up those social groups relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. So the common good is a really important value or virtue or concept that should and ought to undergird how we approach technology and technology in the space of trying to improve our lives. There's also the whole notion of the respect for the dignity of the human person. And Holly took us even beyond the human person by pointing us to the larger groups of beings that we ought to engage with, not just the human beings, but other beings that are a part of our environment. We'll have to remember and recall that, because we do have a sort of species bias that puts the human being in the center, and not only in the center but on the top. And one of the beautiful things about what's going on in the dialogue or discourse in the Christian space, particularly in the mainline communities, is the recognition that the churches have that a lot of what has happened in the world of climate change and the environment has to do with how we have interpreted our scriptures. We have put ourselves, for example, when you think of how the Christian community talks about the book of Genesis and being told that the divine told human beings that they were to go out there and till the earth, they were to conquer it essentially, they could name animals and all of that. If we take that kind of approach to the world, then the world becomes very instrumental and we can use the world as we choose. And perhaps some of that has been what happened, why we're where we are now, because we believe we have control, we have been given control, and we can do what we will with the world. And that's part of what I think is happening or has happened in the West. But the Pope is pointing us to, however, that there are treasures that are at play in the Christian spiritual experience that can provide guidelines for addressing these environmental issues, that faith can bring a new perspective and new initiatives or even incentives that will cause us to look again at how we're treating with the world. So I know oftentimes why the religious gets left out of conversations such as this one is because the religious space is viewed as being dogmatic and domineering. If you don't believe what I believe, then I can't have a conversation with you. And I'd like to argue that the ethical principles that Holly has pointed out are ethical principles that you can find also being lauded and put forward in the religious space. So there is room for conversation. Really quickly, I'll just pull out a couple of ideas that I think are of relevance to our extended conversation here, and we can talk some more about it as we get together in panel. One of the things that the encyclical does point out is that human beings must intervene when a geosystem reaches a critical state. When things get really bad, we have the responsibility to intervene, particularly as we are the ones that, by intervening in the past, have caused things to be where they are. So we have to intervene. The question is, how should we intervene? And that's, a lot of what we've been hearing today. The document also was very good at giving researchers their due and talking about how essential their role is and working at ways at facilitating their interaction and ensuring broad academic freedom. Because you will have religious groups that will want to close down conversations such as this, will want to close down scientific work in certain ways. And they're saying, no, that work should be allowed to happen and the academics should be given religious freedom. The last thing I want to point out, and there's stuff about generational justice and so on that Juan has picked up, but there's one notion that I think is really important for us to think about. The encyclical points out to us that the human environment and the natural environment decay together. So environmental and social degradation need to be addressed together. So it might not be a mistake that the poorest suffer the worst from the gravest effects of global warming. There might be something going on about the mindset that stands in the way of us taking radical decisions to reverse the trend of global warming. And that might be the same mindset that actually stands in the way of us taking radical decisions that are necessary to reverse the trend of global poverty. So there's the idea that what we do with our world, our environment, actually has to do with what we do with those that are poorest and most vulnerable. And we need to therefore engage strategies that are integrated, that will combat poverty, restore the dignity of those that are excluded. And Holly also mentioned several of those groups as well. So we need to work at strategies that will restore the dignity of those that are excluded and work at protecting nature at the same time. It's not an either or, it's a both and. I thank you.